On the 21st of March 1918, the German army launched a major offensive against Allied lines. The Kaiserschlacht, Operation Michael, was launched to attempt to break the Allied lines and allow Germany to seize the Channel ports and deal a significant blow to her enemies. The Allied forces were thrown into a bitter defensive action all along the front. Among them was Lieutenant Alan Ebenezer Kerr. He had been commissioned into the 3rd Battalion Gordon Highlanders and joined the Machine Gun Corps as a section officer with the 61st Battalion of the Machine Gun Corps.
The 61st Battalion of the Machine Gun Corps was formed on the 1st of March 1918. It was formed from the 182nd, 183rd, 184th and 267th Machine Gun Companies. These were the brigade machine gun companies that supported the individual brigades since 1916, and then the 267th was the Reserve Machine Gun Company, which had been introduced in 1917 as an additional divisional asset. Each machine gun company consisted of 4 sections, each of 4 Vickers machine guns, commanded by a subaltern, usually a lieutenant. There were 16 guns in a company, commanded by a major, and a total of 64 machine guns in the battalion, a lieutenant colonel's command. The 61st Battalion was part of the 61st Division. The original companies had been formed in Grantham in June 1916, and then joined the division on the 20th of June. They quickly entered the battle and fought through the actions at Fromelles in June and July 1916. Later in operations on the Ancre in July 1917, the German retreat to the Hindenburg line in April that year, and then the Battle of Ypres in August and September, which included the battle at Langemarck in August. Eventually they were part of the German counterattacks fought against the German counterattacks in early December 1917, which was the last engagement before forming the battalion on the 1st of March. The Battle of St. Quentin was the first action that the battalion had after it had been formed. The battalion remained in service, had actions later in 1918, and stayed in service for the rest of the war, before being demobilised in January 1919 and eventually being fully disbanded in August 1919.
Kerr first saw action in France in 1915 and would also serve in Salonika in 1916, but was sent home to recover from a bout of malaria. Following his recovery, he was promoted to first lieutenant and would return to the Western Front in 1917. It was while on this second posting to the trenches of France, on that first day of the Grand German Offensive, he would win a Victoria Cross, the British Army's highest award for bravery. This would be the 4th VC awarded to a member of the Machine Gun Corps during the Great War. Kerr's section was located near the French town of St. Quentin, between the villages of Francilly, Salsony and Savy. To the south of his position was a redoubt known as Manchester Hill, where Lieutenant Colonel Wilfrid Elstob of the Manchester Regiment would also be awarded a VC, although posthumously, for his leadership in the defence of the redoubt on the same day that Kerr would win his VC. The 61st Battalion War Diary from March 1918 describes the mood in the sector in the days leading up to the start of the offensive. 18th of March 1918. Front normal, nothing to report, casualties nil. 20th of March 1918. Very quiet, aerial activity nil, casualties 1, accidentally wounded. However, the entries into the diary suddenly spring to life, documenting the first day of the largest German offensive of the war. Enemy started an intensive bombardment at 4:40 am on forward and back areas. His infantry advanced to the attack at 9:30 am. The order to man battle stations was ordered about 4:50 am. Owing to the thick fog, little is known of the fighting on the front lines, but Ellis and Eggen redoubts were still holding out at about 11 am. Kerr was quickly involved in heavy fighting from the outset of the German attack, the enemy outflanking his position and attacking in great numbers. Kerr engaged them with a Vickers machine gun. His medal citation from the London Gazette from the 2nd of September reads, Lieutenant Kerr, with 1 Vickers gun, succeeded in engaging the enemy's infantry, approaching under cover of dead ground, and held up the attack, inflicting many casualties. He then sent back word to his battalion headquarters that he had determined to stop with his sergeant and several men who had been badly wounded, and fight until a counterattack could be launched to relieve him. Just as ammunition failed, his party were attacked from behind by the enemy with bombs, machine guns and with the bayonet. Several bayonet attacks were delivered, but each time they were repulsed by Lieutenant Kerr and his companions with their revolvers, the Vickers gun having by this time been destroyed. After seeing off these attacks, the wounded were assembled in a small shelter, and it was decided that these men would be defended to the last. With ammunition at a minimum, Kerr once again stood ready to defend to the last with his revolver and bayonet. The citation continues. Although Lieutenant Kerr was very exhausted from want of food and gas poisoning, and from the supreme exertions he had made during 10 hours of the most severe bombardment, fighting, and attending to the wounded, he refused to surrender until all his ammunition was exhausted, and his position was rushed by large numbers of the enemy. His behaviour throughout the day was absolutely cool and fearless, and by his determination, he was materially instrumental in engaging and holding up for 3 hours more than 500 of the enemy. In the chaos brought upon the Allied lines during the first days of that German offensive, Kerr was presumed missing along with 13 other officers from the battalion. However, Kerr was captured after his heroic last stand and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. As well as those officers, an estimated 320 were also missing as of 22nd of March to the 31st of March. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission records 41 as having died from the 61st Battalion. These losses meant the battalion spent the weeks immediately following in a period of training and reorganisation before returning to the line in mid-April. After his release in November of 1918, Kerr finally received his Victoria Cross on the 26th of November 1919 by King George V. He would later be one of the 100 VC recipients to form the Guard of Honour escorting the gun carriage to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier on the 11th of November 1920. Later in his military career, Kerr was promoted to the rank of Major, and he was placed on the Reserve of Officers list by the Army in 1922, having been effectively demobilised, after being attached to the War Office staff as a staff officer. In the interwar period, he was recalled into the Army in 1940 and served on the Chief of the Imperial Staff at the War Office during the Second World War. He passed away at the age of 75 on the 12th of September 1958. For their bravery in the face of the first day of the biggest German offensive of the Great War, the 61st Battalion, MGC, were thanked by Sir Douglas Haig in a dispatch on the 28th of March 1918. The following has been received from the Army Commander. By the grand and stubborn way you were holding out and delaying the advance of the enemy, your great exertions and sacrifices are not being thrown away. They are of immense importance, and your resistance and deeds in this great battle will live on for all time and will save our country. Herbert George Columbine was born in Penge, South London, on the 28th of November 1893. He was born into a military family. His father was killed in the Boer War, serving with the Lincolnshire Regiment at Zillicats on the 11th of July 1900, when Herbert was just 6 years old. By that time, the family had moved to Essex, to the seaside town of Walton-on-the-Naze. Herbert joined the British Army in 1911, joining the 19th Queen's Alexandra's Own Royal Hussars. In June 1916, with the formation of the Machine Gun Corps, he was transferred into the 9th Machine Gun Squadron, 9th Cavalry Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division, as part of the MGC Cavalry.
Alongside the infantry branch of the Machine Gun Corps, formed in October 1915, there was a cavalry branch formed to provide machine gun squadrons to support cavalry brigades. Each squadron had 6 sections each of 2 Vickers machine guns. Like the infantry, they used limbered wagons and pack saddlery to carry their guns, but their role was more offensive and exploitative, in line with the overall principles for cavalry units. Hence the smaller sub-units of 2 guns each to give better flexibility. The 9th Brigade Machine Gun Squadron was formed from units of the 9th Cavalry Brigade, part of the 1st Cavalry Division. It was formed on 28th of February 1916, and it included the machine gun sections of the 15th Hussars, the 19th Hussars and the 1st Bedfordshire Yeomanry. Its first action as part of the reserve to the 14th Corps of 4th Army was on the 15th of September 1916. It was involved in many engagements subsequent to this throughout the war and would often be part of mobile reserves or providing additional machine guns for preparatory barrages or other tasks. The squadron would eventually return to the UK alongside the 1st Cavalry Division in August 1919 and was disbanded while serving in Ireland on the 1st of December 1919.
Herbert had already seen combat at Mons in 1914 and at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915 with the 19th Hussars, leading up to his Victoria Cross action on the 22nd of March 1918 at Hervey Wood on the second day of the German spring offensive, launched to attempt to knock Allied forces out of the war. This was the second Victoria Cross awarded to a member of the MGC during the Kaiserschlacht, the first being won by Lieutenant Alan Kerr of the 61st Division the day previously. To learn more about his action, use the link in the description or see the link at the end of the video. The 9th Machine Gun Squadron were in billets in late March 1918 before being moved to Burness near St Quintin on the 20th of March, as detailed in their war diaries. 20th of the 3rd, 1918. Moved to Burness, received at 7:45 am, squadron moved off to brigade starting point and then to Burness. 22nd of the 3rd, 1918. Remainder of squadron stood 2 up, 1 am, and then moved to Montigny Farm. The squadrons were shelled as enemy troops started their assault onto the British positions. On the 22nd of March, Herbert was in a trench in Hervey Wood. An eyewitness to Columbine's heroism, PGC Atkinson, describes the makeup of positions held in the woods during the German attack and Herbert's subsequent actions on the day. Part of our defence system included machine gun posts somewhat in advance of the main trench. The men working this were all knocked out. Running the gauntlet of very heavy fire, Private Columbine rushed forward and took charge of this gun. He was followed by some comrades, and in spite of the fact that the whole of the enemy machine guns were in immediate neighbourhood, concentrated their heaviest fire upon the post, which was almost unprotected by any of the devices commonly used, Columbine kept the machine gun going for over 4 hours. At the time, the enemy had been working around the position with strong forces, and actually had the post cut off, save for one narrow gap by which it was still possible to communicate with the main position. For the whole of the time, save when he went across the fire-swept ground to bring ammunition, the brave chap remained at his post, and despite frequent rushes, he kept the enemy at bay. In the course of the fight, a German officer appeared and repeatedly urged his men to the attack on the isolated post. But every rush of the Germans was stopped in a few yards by the deadly fire from this brave gunner. He was actually wounded, but continued to work the gun in spite of that. Columbine defended his section from the hours of 9 am to 1 pm in the afternoon. I will now read from his medal citation from the 3rd of May 1918. During this time, wave after wave of the enemy failed to get up to him. Owing to his being attacked by a low-flying aeroplane, the enemy last gained a strong footing in the trench on either side. The position being untenable, he ordered the 2 remaining men to get away, and, though being bombed from either side, kept his gun firing and inflicting tremendous losses. He was eventually killed by a bomb, which blew up him and his gun. He showed throughout the highest valour, determination, and self-sacrifice. Atkinson heard the last words heard from Columbine. "Save yourselves, I'll carry on," was what he said. They were reluctant to go, but he insisted. In the end they came to see the force of his contention, that there was no point in sacrificing 3 lives where one was enough. He shouted a few words of farewell, and that was the last his comrades heard from him. Herbert's mother, Emma Columbine, was awarded her son's posthumous VC at Buckingham Palace on the 22nd of June, 3 months to the day of her 24-year-old son's gallant actions in Hervey Wood. On the 27th of November 1920, in his hometown of Walton-on-the-Naze, a bronze bust was erected in Columbine's honour, unveiled by Lord Byng of Vimy, which now stands in a leisure centre in Walton-on-Naze called the Columbine Centre. The plaque underneath the bust reads, "He refused to retire when others might have done so." In 2014, a full-size statue was unveiled on the seafront in Walton-on-Naze in memorial to Columbine's bravery after a statue fund was set up under the patronage of Dame Judi Dench. The statue, sculptured by John Doubleday, was unveiled on the 1st of August 2014 and was unveiled by Lord Field Marshal Guthrie. Columbine's Victoria Cross is now on display at the Essex Regimental Museum in Chelmsford. Arthur Henry Cross was born in Shipton, Norfolk on the 13th of December 1884. The Great War was in its second year when Cross enlisted with the 21st Battalion of the 1st Surrey Rifles, London Regiment, on the 30th of May 1916. In 1917, he transferred into the Machine Gun Corps. At this time of his VC winning exploits, in March of 1918, he was an acting Lance Corporal of the 121st Company, 40th Battalion of the 40th Division. He was part of C Company during this time.
As a battalion of the Machine Gun Corps infantry branch on the Western Front, the 40th was formed from the machine gun companies of the 40th Division. The 119th, the 120th, 121st Brigade Machine Gun Companies and the 244th Divisional Machine Gun Company. The battalion had a total of 64 Vickers machine guns across these four companies. The Brigade Machine Gun Companies had joined the division on the 19th of June 1916 while it was at Bruay. The Vickers machine guns of those companies replaced that were in the infantry battalions, as the infantry were now equipped with the Lewis gun for their automatic firepower, which was much more suited to an infantry battalion, being simpler to train on and more flexible in its use. The division had these three companies for just over a year before a fourth divisional company was added, the 244th, on the 20th of July 1917 while at Houdecourt. The last action of the individual companies was the capture of Bourlon-Wood from the 23rd to the 25th of November 1917, before being amalgamated into the 40th Battalion on the 25th of February 1918. The battalion's first action was the Battle of St Quentin, and it received heavy losses during this and the following month, being reduced to a training cadre on the 2nd of May 1918, with all the personnel being returned to the Machine Gun Corps base depot, and the battalion eventually disbanded only 1 week later on the 9th of May 1918.
As mentioned in a previous video, Operation Michael had been launched against the British, Empire and Allied forces of the Western Front in an attempt by the German army to drive a wedge between the Allied lines and force the Allies into surrender. Cross and the rest of his battalion were positioned around the town of Eviers, France, between Arras and Bapaume. The actions of the division in the days before the attack were detailed in the 40th Battalion's war diary for March 1918. March 1917. Instructions received from 40th Division for move of brigade groups to positions of assembly in the event of an attack taking place on 6 and 17 Corps fronts. The Germans started blasting the 40th Battalion's positions on the 21st of March. All companies of the battalion were soon engaged in heavy fighting. British troops reporting seeing swarms of enemy soldiers rushing towards their lines. Cross and his company were overrun during the fighting, and 2 of his 4 machine guns were captured, along with Cross himself. After a brief period as a prisoner of war, Cross succeeded in rejoining the remaining guns of his section that evening. An after-action report in the battalion's war diary tells us more about Cross's actions that day that led to him receiving a Victoria Cross. When day broke, having obtained permission from Sergeant Brennan, commanding the section, he reconnoitred the position of his captured guns and found it occupied by the enemy. He attacked them single-handed and captured 7 Germans, whom he forced to carry back the guns, tripods, and ammunition to our lines, where he rejoined his section. Upon the recapture of his section guns, Cross and the rest of C Company were able to see off a large 6-waved attack made by German troops, with C Company fighting well in advance of the infantry in their sector. For his bravery and unwillingness to see his gun remain in the hands of the enemy, Lance Corporal Cross was awarded the VC on the 4th of June 1918. His medal citation further describes the determination of this NCO on that day. It is impossible to speak too highly of the extreme gallantry and dash displayed by this NCO, who showed throughout 4 days of operations supreme devotion to duty. Not only did Cross receive a VC for his bravery on the Western Front in 1918, but he later went on to be awarded a military medal in late August 1918, but I've been unable to find a citation for this award. However, it is mentioned in the London Gazette on the 29th of August 1918. Arthur finally received his medal from King George V in September 1918. Post-war life, unfortunately for Cross, would be tough. After he was discharged from the army in March 1918, by early 1920 he lived in Southwark and was suffering from gastritis. An appeal was made by his local newspaper, The Globe, on the 29th of March 1920. The headline read, "Rallying to RVC." The newspaper had set up a donation fund for Cross and his family, who, as it was reported in the paper, were living under unfortunate conditions. At the time of that paper's publication, the Cross family had received £36 of public donations. In 1923, Cross found himself in court on charges of street betting, and during the Second World War, he would lose his second wife and 2 children to a German bombing raid in 1941. However, there would be a small silver lining for Cross, and for his VC, from an unlikely source. In 1954, Cross responded to an advert appealing for a genuine VC that was to be used in the upcoming film Carrington VC, the military courtroom drama that starred David Niven in the lead. Cross was invited to the film's set at Shepperton Studios and presented his medal to Niven for use in the film. Cross was also present at the film's premiere in December of the same year, his medal up on the silver screen for all to admire. Arthur Henry Cross passed away in 1965, aged 80. His medals were held privately by his remaining family until 2012, where they were sold at auction to an anonymous buyer for £185,000. Arthur is buried in Streatham Vale Cemetery in London. The next medal recipient to be featured in my roundup of the Victoria Cross winners in collaboration with the VMGCRA is Harold Sanford Mugford, who was awarded his medal for his actions on the 11th of April 1917. Born at 149 Keaton's Road, Bermondsey, in 1894, Harold was a clerk in his civilian life, but in 1912 he enlisted into the Essex Yeomanry Regiment, part of the Territorial Army. At the outbreak of war in 1914, he was shipped overseas in November of that year, and he saw his first action at Ypres in 1915, where Mugford, along with his regiment, took part in the Battle of Friesenberg Ridge on the 8th of May 1915. By the time he was 22 years old, Harold had been promoted to a lance corporal in the 8th Cavalry Squadron Machine Gun Corps, of which he had transferred into in March 1916.
The 8th Squadron of the Machine Gun Corps Cavalry was attached to the 8th Cavalry Brigade in the 3rd Cavalry Division. They had been formed on the 29th of February 1916 from within the brigade, and this would have amalgamated the machine gun sections of the Royal Horse Guards, the 10th Hussars and the 1st Essex Yeomanry. Each section would provide 2 troops to make the machine gun squadron a total of 6 troops of 2 guns each. In October 1916, the Royal Horse Guards section was exchanged with the 1st Leicestershire Yeomanry section from 7th Machine Gun Squadron. The squadron took part in a number of engagements, including the First Battle of the Scarpe and the attack at Monchy-le-Preux, both in April 1917, during which Harold Mugford was awarded his Victoria Cross. The squadron left 3rd Cavalry Division when 8th Brigade left in March 1918.
Mugford and his comrades were to be involved in the Second Battle of Arras in 1917, which was a British effort to dislodge the German forces in the area and make a significant breakthrough on the Western Front. The operation that took place between the 9th of April and the 16th of May 1917 saw a total of 25 Victoria Crosses awarded for acts of bravery in face of the enemy. The 8th Cavalry Squadron War Diary details their movements on the morning of the 11th of April 1917. 8 a.m. Following an infantry attack earlier in the morning, 10th Royal Hussars with sections 3, 1 and the Essex Yeomanry with sections 5 and 6 moved on Monchy-le-Preux. They dismounted for action in the village and occupied a defensive line on north and east side of village, facing Pelvez and Bois de Start. After setting up these positions, the men defending them were put under heavy artillery bombardment as the Germans looked to retake the village. Number 3 section lost their ammunition supplies due to shelling, and Number 2 section had 1 gun put out of action. The gunners of the MGC were instrumental in the defence of the town. Mugford's actions that day were recollected in his London Gazette citation from the 26th of November 1917. Under intense shell and machine gun fire, Lance Corporal Mugford succeeded in getting his machine gun into a forward and very exposed position. From this point, he was able to deal most effectively with the enemy, who were massing for a counterattack. His number 2 was killed almost immediately, and at the same moment he himself was severely wounded. He was then ordered to a new position and told to go to a dressing station as soon as the position was occupied. He refused to go to the dressing station, but continued on duty with his gun, inflicting severe loss on the enemy. Soon after, he was again wounded, a shell breaking both of his legs. He still remained with his gun, begging his comrades to leave him and take cover. Shortly afterwards, this non-commissioned officer was removed to the dressing station, where he was again wounded in the arm. The valour and initiative displayed by Lance Corporal Mugford was instrumental in breaking up the impending counterattack of the enemy. Expected to die from his wounds, Harold defied all the odds of surviving his ordeal, but having both of his legs amputated. He was eventually invalided home, where he spent a couple of months recuperating at the Ampthill Road VAD Hospital in Bedford, where he learnt of his award. When interviewed for the Bedfordshire Times, he said, "I am the lucky one out of many. I am sure that others deserve just as much recognition, especially my number 2, Corporal Jones, who was killed. It came early in the morning. It was quite the most glorious sensation I've ever had, going over the top on a GG. We had an objective given us 2 miles away. We had to get there somehow and hold the place until the infantry could get up. They were shelling us like hell when I copped it." Harold was presented his Victoria Cross by King George V at Buckingham Palace on the 3rd of July, 1918. Then, in August of the same year, he was presented a cheque for £300 by the Mayor of Eastham, which had been raised in his honour of his bravery at the front. Mugford was involved in various charitable fundraising efforts during his later life, and during the Second World War he aided the Chelmsford Flight of Fighters Fund. In 2017, a plaque commemorating his VC was erected close to the Bermondsey War Memorial. Born in Calcutta, British India on September 17, 1892, John Reginald Noble Graham, the son of Sir Frederick Graham, spent his youth being educated at Eton and Trinity Colleges in London and Cambridge, respectively. He was in his 20s when war was declared in 1914 and joined up. He was commissioned into the 9th Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in 1916, where he was attached to the 136th Company of the Machine Gun Corps, who was sent to Mesopotamia.
The 136th Machine Gun Company was formed at Gibraltar from the machine gun sections of a second-line Highland Division, possibly the 64th Division. There was one section each from the 6th, 8th and 9th Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and one from the Highland Light Infantry. On attachment to the 7th Meerut Division of the Indian Army in Mesopotamia in August 1916, they were attached to the 28th Infantry Brigade, which included the 2nd Battalion Leicestershire Regiment, 51st and 53rd Sikhs, and the 56th Punjabi Rifles. The company in Mesopotamia was organised in the same way as that across the Machine Gun Corps, with 4 sections of 4 guns each. Where a section contained 2 officers, they would sometimes command a pair of guns each and act semi-independently, as was in Reginald Graham's case during the action for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. The nominal strength of the section was 34 men, but it was soon depleted and down to 14 men during the Estabelet action. The first action in which 136th Company took part was the 24th of February 1917 at Sanaya. Then 9th to 10th of March, operations on the Tigris Bank, and the 11th of March, the occupation of Baghdad. On the 14th of March, the action at Estabelet, and then the 24th of April was the occupation of Samarra. Later, on the 2nd of November 1917, they fought at Doha, before becoming lines of communication troops in January 1918, having moved to Egypt. They would form part of the 7th Indian Battalion, the Machine Gun Corps, when it was formed in March 1918, and this then supported the division as it advanced into Palestine, where it continued until the end of the war.
Reginald would see action here during the Samarra offensive, in which a combined Indian and British force were facing the armies of the Ottoman Empire. During the offensive, Reginald would be awarded a Victoria Cross for heroism under fire on the 22nd of April, 1917. In a letter home to his mother in March 1917, Graham wrote in his diary detailing the movement and actions of the men and guns under his command in the days leading up to his VC actions. 20th April, Note, by John Reginald Noble Graham. This was all written later on rejoining the old company. Moved up to new positions in order to attack Istabalat's position. 21st. Istabalat attacked and carried enemy's main position. Our brigade was in reserve. Clark and his section were sent forward with one of our native infantry units and came in for some baddish shelling. No casualties. We had an excellent view from the top of the median wall. There is a brief mention in the diary of the action on the 22nd of April. 10 a.m. first enemy shells came over, attacked enemy secondary position about 4 p.m, wounded about 5:30 or 6 p.m. Graham's medal citation from the London Gazette gives us further insight into the lieutenant's exploits that day. Lieutenant Graham accompanied his guns across open ground, under very heavy rifle and machine gun fire, and when his men became casualties, he assisted in carrying the ammunition. Although twice wounded, he continued during the advance to control his guns and was able, with one gun, to open an accurate fire on the enemy, who were massing for a counterattack. The gun was put out of action by the enemy's rifle fire, and he was again wounded. The advancing enemy forced him to retire, but before doing so, he further disabled his gun, rendering it useless. He then brought a Lewis gun into action, with excellent effect, till all the ammunition was expended. He was then again severely wounded, and forced, through loss of blood, to retire. His valour and skillful handling of his guns held up a strong counterattack, which threatened to roll up the left flank of the brigade, and thus averted what might have been a very critical situation. Gazetted in September 1917, the 1st Machine Gun Corps Victoria Cross to be announced. After his bravery under fire, Graham was taken to the casualty clearing station and was soon transferred to a hospital in Baghdad to recover from his wounds. He recounted his ordeal to his mother in a letter on the 28th of April 1917. We came under terrific rifle and MG crossfire. 9 out of 14 of my 2 teams were hit, and myself as well. My servant Rennie was killed, poor wee devil. I was hit in the right hand first. It has smashed the tip of my first finger and thumb, and laid open the big muscle down to the wrist. There is a nasty, dirty wound. No bones touched. I got a second through the right leg, just in the rear of the shin bone and knee. A few minutes later, this one has numbed my foot a bit, but I can use it and it is already better. Number 3 is a graze across the right cheek, just below my right eye. A scar for life, but that does not matter. Number 4 went through my MG and got me in the left forearm. In and out, in 2 halves, inches, flesh wound only. The last 2 were snipers, as I tried to mount and fire the gun. Number 5 I got a quarter of an hour later. So here I am, about as lucky as I could be, 6 wounds, and not a bone touched, not a bullet in me. Heat is ghastly. This hospital is not good, and far too busy. Once he had healed, Graham was promoted to captain and went back to Mesopotamia, and served until January of 1918, when the company transferred to Palestine. While there, he took command, obtaining the rank of major. He would later serve through the Second World War as a lieutenant colonel, and received both the MBE and Norwegian King Haakon's 7th Liberty Cross for his service. Graham's Victoria Cross is normally held in Stirling Castle at the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Museum, and a memorial stone was unveiled in 2017 at the Cardos War Memorial in Scotland. William Allison White was born on October the 19th, 1894 in Mitcham, South London. At the start of the Great War, White initially served in the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment. He rose through the ranks and became a sergeant before transferring into the MGC in 1918, and had been promoted to the rank of second lieutenant in the 38th Battalion. By September 1918, the British and Allied forces on the Western Front were preparing for an assault on the Hindenburg Line. But before that could happen, German defences south of the line had to be attacked. This task was undertaken by the British 4th Army on a 17-mile front around the French town of Epie. White's battalion were to attack Gouzeaucourt to the north. The 38th Battalion relieved the 17th Battalion MGC on the 11th of September, who then occupied their positions in the town. White was part of D Company when he would be awarded the VC for his actions during the battle. Their war diary states the setup of the battalion's companies before the start of the battle. Advanced redistribution of guns in depth. A company in front system covering support trench. B and C companies on main line of resistance east of Besset Wood. D Company in close support just north of Gouzier Court Road. All companies to use vigorous harassing fire, especially at night. The Battle of Epie started on the 18th of September, with the 38th Battalion supporting the attack with their machine guns. D Company attacked Height, the exact location unknown. White's actions during the fighting were described in the war diary as follows. Lieutenant White, with other forward section, accounted 2 machine gun posts and greatly assisted infantry in consolidation. His medal citation in the London Gazette adds even more details to the diary entry. When the advance of the infantry was being delayed by an enemy machine gun, he rushed the gun position single-handedly, shot the 3 gunners, and captured the gun. Later, in similar circumstances, he attacked a gun accompanied by 2 men, but both the latter were immediately shot down. He went alone to the gun position and bayoneted or shot the team of 5 men and captured the gun. On a third occasion, when the advance was held up by hostile fire from an enemy position, he collected a small party and rushed the position, inflicting heavy losses on the garrison. White's conduct during the battle being described as fearless and unhesitating. He would be presented his VC on the 27th of March 1919 by King George V. In November 1921, the Sphere reported that William unveiled a memorial cross by St. Luke's Parish. He also married Violet Price in the same year. During the Second World War, he was commissioned as a captain in the Royal Artillery of the Territorial Army. He passed away at the age of 79 on the 13th of September 1974. He was cremated in Shrewsbury and is remembered on his wife's gravestone in St. John's the Evangelist Churchyard in Kent. A memorial was held for White on the 18th of September 2018 at the Mitcham War Memorial, where a commemorative paving stone now lies. His medal is now on display as part of the Lord Ashcroft collection at the IWM, London. David Stuart McGregor, born in Edinburgh on the 16th of October 1895, worked as an apprentice for the Northbridge branch of the Commercial Bank of Scotland pre-war. In 1914, he, like many young men his own age, joined up. Initially, McGregor enlisted into the Royal Artillery as a gunner, but in 1915 he was commissioned into the Royal Scots Lothian Regiment as a lieutenant. He was sent to Egypt in 1916 and later served on the Western Front, where, at the time of his VC-winning exploits, he was attached to the 29th Battalion MGC, serving in D Company, attached to the 1st Border Regiment in Belgium in October of 1918. By that time, the Allied forces were deep into a series of major offensives that would collectively be known as the 100 Days Offensive. During this period, the German forces and their Austro-Hungarian allies were beaten back towards their own borders as the Allied nations racked up victory after victory. But before the final act of the Great War was to be written in November, there was still much bloody and bitter fighting to be undertaken by both sides. McGregor was serving on the front line near the Belgian town of Hoogmolen, situated close to the French border. It was to be the location where the last Machine Gun Corps Victoria Cross of the Great War would be earned. On the 22nd of October, the battalion were attacking German lines supporting the 86th Brigade and had faced what the war diary called very strong resistance. The entry directly after this starts to describe McGregor's actions during the subsequent advance. Lieutenant McGregor performed a very gallant action, which unfortunately lost him his life. The advance was held up, and this officer, ordering his men to cross a piece of open ground by any cover they could find, got his guns with a limber, and lifting it into the limber himself, ordered the driver to drive the guns across lots of open ground to a sunken road. This worked, although the horses were both lost. The guns were put into action. The official medal citation from the 13th of December 1918 goes on to depict the 23-year-old officer's final moments. The driver, horses, and limber were all hit, but Lieutenant McGregor succeeded in getting the guns into action, effectively engaging the enemy and enabling the advance to be resumed. With the utmost gallantry, he continued to expose himself in order to direct and control the fire of his guns until about an hour later he was killed. His great gallantry and supreme devotion to duty were the admiration of all ranks. On the 15th of February 1919, King George V presented the VC to David's parents at Buckingham Palace. He is buried at the Stazegem Communal Cemetery in Flanders, Belgium, and there was a memorial stone unveiled at McGregor's former school, George Heriot School, in Edinburgh. His Victoria Cross, along with other service medals, are now on display at the Royal Scots Museum at Edinburgh Castle. Throughout this series, the things that I was constantly reminded of when reading war diaries and medal citations is not only the dedication to the men around them in the carnage and confusion that battle can cause, but also the care of which these men put into the machine guns they maintained in support of their comrades, something which I think is unique to the men who served in the Machine Gun Corps during the Great War. They also share a theme that is common among almost all Victoria Cross winners. It's the courage and selflessness shown by all recipients of a medal that seems to transcend its own history and has now become a byword for heroism under fire.